how to handle the Russian pressure against the interests of Poland. The answer to this question was one of the key efforts of Strategy and Future from the very beginning. This was the initial concept behind the project titled the 20th War, whose aim is to look at a wide range of the new generation of Russian instruments of war from a strategic point of view, and not just in the military sense. Contrary to popular opinion, Poland has the potential to realistically oppose Russian pressure in the perspective of a decade, and the 20th War project is to help in this end. The starting point is the interest of Poland, while taking into account the architecture of existing alliances and international relations or structures, such as NATO or the EU. However, at the same time, we must assume that the next 10 years may shake up the current international order, and we must be a partner in this game, not a vassal, as today. As Jerzy Giedroyć once wrote, we should realize that the stronger our position in the East, the more important we will be in Western Europe. And more, our Eastern policy may be an opportunity. Without falling into national megalomania, we must pursue an independent policy and not be a client of the United States or any other power. In the East, the instrument of politics in 2020, which will certainly remain so until 2030, was the broadly understood instruments of the new generation of war, whereas the main political factor was Russia, which presents itself as the main player in this part of the world. It presses on the Baltic-Black Sea bridge through which it wants to influence the balance of the European system and change its security architecture. In Polish 21st century strategic thought, despite the sometimes wonderful achievements of the last 500 years, there is no institutionalized modern strategic culture based on a system of assumptions resulting from our experiences, our country's geography, current threats, and our geopolitical environment. This requires an understanding of the changing potentials of enemies and allies, as well as social conditions supported by self-tasking and consistent political practice shaping the great strategy of the state. Meanwhile, Poland, in the 21st century, due to its location, population, and economy, is in a favorable position to become a real force between the Gulf of Finland and the Carpathians. Unfortunately, it has not yet prepared for such a role despite the last 30 years of economic development. In Strategy and Future, since the summer of 2000, we have conducted a series of conceptual considerations and simulation workshops, the so-called tabletop exercises, which boil down to one basic observation. The non-negotiable interest of the Republic of Poland is to keep Russia outside of the European system, where the latter can't be a balancer in the geopolitical game. Brutal, and at the same time obvious, this fundamental observation is the backbone of our country's fate. This very observation proved successful for most of the last 500 years, but was changed by the Saxon times and then the partitions of Poland. Much later, the fall of Tsarist Russia and victory in the Polish Bolshevik War of 1920 pushed Soviet Russia out of the European system, which gave Poland breathing space for 20 years. However, Russia returned to the European system by signing a continental pact with Germany in the summer of 1939 and strengthened its presence even more after the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945. At the end of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of the countries to our immediate east pushed Russia, once again, out of the European system. This Russia was on the way to disintegrating or becoming a protectorate of the West. However, in stepped Vladimir Putin and chose a very different path: the decision to stop the project of geopolitical expansion of the West, which served Polish security interests so well after the collapse of the USSR, and which we still dream of today in Poland. Ultimately, After the Georgian War of August 2008, we are dealing with a revised form of the old imperial Russia, now supported by the development of new generation war, thanks to which the Russians can return to the game in Europe and in their geopolitical surroundings. It is the efficient use of a wide range of these new generation war mechanisms that, unfortunately for us, effectively invites Russia, mainly by France, and sometimes also by Germany, to be a balancing power in Europe and Eurasia. And who knows, maybe even the USA, in the context of Eurasia and the need to harness Russia so as to balance China's rising power, will join in these invitations. We must be aware that there is a real competition for power in our region, the participants of which are waging a real war using the mechanisms of a new generation of war, balancing between military conflict and the entire spectrum of covert, non-kinetic actions. The Russians are perfecting themselves in these matters and laboriously trying to return to the imperial game. Georgia, Crimea, Donbass, Belarus, the Baltic states, Syria, and the Caucasus are all examples of these efforts. So the matter is simple, but it is not easy. The possibility of extending an invitation to Russia to play in the equilibrium of the European system must, for the interest of Poland, be eliminated. At Strategy and Future, we ran through practical ways how Russia is being invited to the table, what is the focus of its politics, what makes its policy possible, and how the Russians are or can become indispensable, such as to the French. We began to wonder how to counteract this, and in fact, this is what the 20th War Project boils down to. Since the Russian center of gravity is a new generation of warfare instruments, thanks to which Russia is a desirable participant, war is perhaps unwanted but still remains a factor in the game for balance with Western countries. Russia is not, there is no doubt about it, a desirable participant because of its thriving economy, innovation, or the advantages of its wonderful civilizational model. It should be realized just why Russia is needed by Western powers. First, energy, although less and less as time goes on. Second, its geographical location, which will become more important if the Eurasian project under the economic leadership of China becomes more feasible. Finally, but most importantly, because of the military power used in the context of next generation of war to stabilize the periphery of Europe and to play for the balance of European countries against Turkey, China, the Middle East, and perhaps even one day against the USA. Russia is not attractive in terms of its model of civilization, so it must have power mechanisms in its near abroad through the use of new generational conflict. First, through positive actions, stabilizing safety, and also through negative actions, destabilizing safety. It must be a shareholder in a company called the European system. It is therefore necessary to overcome the Russian instruments of new generational conflict and therefore Russian strength. Seemingly obvious, but realizing this leads to radical conclusions. And this is what we are doing in our 20th War Project. What is the Russian center of gravity that must be broken? The answer is simple. It is the defeat of the Russian military, which includes the level of first demonstrating such capabilities while maintaining correlation with political goals and knowing the nature of such a confrontation. The conclusions are as follows. There is a need for Poland to create its own protective system in the intermarium, which would be primarily aimed at defeating the Russian threat, its armed forces, and in particular the perception of their power, the so-called protection by denial. As part of this active defense in the eastern borderlands, we will then have a defensive umbrella against alleged Russian control of the ladder of escalation, any alleged resulting violence, as well as a counterweight to the Russian acquisition of political agency within a concert of European powers at our expense. The threshold for achieving this goal is not as high as most Poles think, and whose strategic thinking was first strangled by Soviet domination, then stunned by the vision of the end of history, and now fears alleged Russian power against which we supposedly have no chance. Today, the threshold of Russian power is not so high so that it cannot be faced. And we can't only depend on Western countries for an intervention that they may or may not be willing to carry out or simply have no interest in. These are the lines along which we think in Strategy and Future. These considerations are certainly also made in Ankara and Istanbul, because such a strategy is exactly what the Turks have been effectively doing for several years. It can be said that they are implementing elements of the old Polish Promethean policy towards the east, using their own elements of a new generation of Turkish war, which was evident in Syria, Libya, and the Caucasus. The matter is simple. One has to defeat Russian strength. In the military dimension, it is necessary to establish a real political goal for Poland, which includes a possible military conflict and specific political conditions for the involvement of the Polish armed forces. It is not about the general perspective of a conflict with Russia. Rather, it is the clarification of a specific, tangible set of goals. What would the war bring in order for us to consider that we have won it? This means that it is necessary to answer a very specific question. What kind of war are the Polish armed forces to prepare for? Without this answer, the entire effort to modernize, reform, and then eventual military action will end up in vain. Additionally, military successes do not translate directly into political benefits. Meanwhile, war is only an instrument of politics about which our homeland, torn by successive continental and world wars, and our elites probably do not know or have forgotten about. The question arises whether we are preparing for a coalition war or an independent one, universal or limited, at sea or on land, east of our borders or inside them in a defensive war, or maybe, just like 15 years ago, an expeditionary war. What will be the specific theater of war and the area of operations and movement, and therefore what will be its operational basis, and what will be the lines of communication leading to the zone of hostilities? How to match signaling and military goals with political goals in the everyday turmoil of events in order to win the war before its kinetic phase begins, and then to win in the informational, narrative, and political domain. War is a complex and strictly political matter. One can risk the statement that warfare itself is only a fragment of a larger whole that needs to be tasked, organized, and thought of as a whole. Once this is established, one should begin to think about what would be the military goal of such a war, and therefore what tool or what armed forces we need to achieve this goal. This tool must be tailored specifically to the assumed goals of political war. This will determine the opponent's so-called point of gravity, which must also be considered in the process of shaping the grand strategy of the state, and therefore also determining what exactly may threaten the state. Of course, we must also understand what are the goals of the enemy's war and what is our center of gravity, the breaking of which would mean our political and often also military defeat. Once we have established the center of gravity, we will know what tool we need. Whether it will be large, small, heavy, mobile, mass conscription or professional forces, for limited or universal war, for guerrilla or conventional operations, for operations on land or at sea, or with a high degree of symmetry and intensity. We must analyze the Russian way of thinking about armed conflict, and in particular the desire to control every link in the chain of escalation of the conflict in order to find the right answer to each of the possible stages of this prospective war. Once this is established, we will consider how to use this tool. We must therefore thoroughly consider what it should be capable of, and therefore what capabilities our armed forces and the entire system of state management and resistance should have. Here, there is a need to prepare, among others, the operational concepts, military technology, and the organization of the armed forces to implement these capabilities. Then, we will have a method of evaluating the aforementioned tool, which is the organization of the military, the entire system of efficiency and readiness assessment, the system of promotion, military exercises, soldiers' motivation, doctrine, creating improvements and advantages at the operational and tactical level, and implementing technologies that increase combat potential. An army prepared in this way is an instrument of the state's policy also in times of peace, because it serves as strategic signaling and as such acts as a deterrent to any aggressor, or it is used as a balancing factor when the constructivist system of the international order collapses. We are dealing with the latter process right now, so the need for change is urgent. Thus, we need our own strategic tool and our own operational plans conceived, drawn up, rehearsed, and implemented in Warsaw. The end goal of the 20th War in Strategy and Future is to prepare the starting point and key foundations for the new operational concept for the war in the East, designed for the Polish armed forces for the period after 2020. To achieve this, a number of milestones are needed. First, determining the goal of the political conflict from the perspective of Russia and Poland, as well as the scenarios of the road to war. Next, testing multiple scenarios that we want to conduct, each one more than once, on real politicians to be able to illustrate certain rules and repeating mechanisms so that we can learn how bad decisions are made and thus can be ruled out. It is also crucial to specify the theory of war, or what is the political goal of a possible conflict for both sides. Also critical is the definition of each side's center of gravity. What will each opponent strive for, and thus what instrument they will need to achieve this goal, overcoming the opponent's center of gravity. Additionally, it must be clarified what organizational and technical abilities will be needed to undertake all of this. The ladder of escalation requires an in-depth analysis with a detailed specification of all its levels, and importantly, identification of the gaps in the ladder control system on the Russian side. Ultimately, it is necessary to rehearse the political scenarios leading to the conflict, understanding what is the goal of the war and its own center of gravity. The result of these considerations will be an operational concept within the modern understanding of war and conflict, which is much different from our ideas about a war shaped by the trauma of World War II. In the new generation of war, politicians and thinking in a system that uses capabilities must play an extremely important role. The vital issue is the number of decisions that politicians have to make, and this keeping up with the lightning pace of modern war and its windows of decision time. All within the OODA loop, that is the conjunction of observation, orientation, decision, and action, so that said loop is as quick as possible. Contemporary war is also broader and multi-domain in nature, not only kinetic and strictly military. The role of politicians is simply crucial. In fact, the war does not belong to the military, but to the politicians. The clashes themselves belong to the military. This is especially true of new generation warfare, where the tactical level is intertwined with the strategic and political level, with everyday consequences for the changing balance of power and the perception of these forces. It is also important not to fall into a technological spiral related to kinetic clashes, which is a common affliction in Poland. This should be turned into abilities and system thinking. It is not technology and hardware units that are waging a war. Rather, it is the system using those abilities. The system works in a rhythm. An understanding of these regularities should be developed by the commanding staff. There is a need to use intuition and the understanding of the correlation of forces and flows on the battlefield. That is, information flows and the current and ever-smooth assessment of the forces and resources at one's own and the opponent's disposal, which has not changed in Europe since the Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s. The real commander understands that an army's rhythm is most important, and it can only be shaped empirically. However, rather than through war, it should be done through repeated exercises, preferably at any time of the year and with varying degrees of disruption to information and communication, especially on the highly digitized battlefield of today, where information domination decides the time, place, and results of kinetic clashes. An army's rhythm is dependent on information, dominance, and the coordination of command, communication, and situational awareness system that is the center of gravity on the contemporary battlefield. The Polish army is at the beginning of a long road towards the modern battlefield. An effective rhythm is most important for obtaining information dominance at a specific time and place, which translates into the initiative and therefore into a kinetic win. This makes learning and practice mandatory and critical. Above all, practice must be for independent warfare, since there are more difficult times ahead and the help of allies is uncertain. The expert group that works on the 20th War project is divided into two teams, red and blue. The red team, led by Marek Pudzisz, gets into the point of view and the way of thinking of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, doctrinally and by studying literature, analyzing exercises from the past and patterns seen in previous wars. The blue team, guided by the interests of the Republic of Poland, is led by Jacek Bartosiak. The intended result is an internal report to the Polish General Staff, institutions of the Polish Army, and the state security system, other state institutions, and external reports to the public. It will present the problems that we must solve in order to face the next generation of war. In Strategy and Future, we try to influence the perception of our allies as to our strategic priorities, which has been a neglected topic for many years. We believe that intellectual work carried out independently without external pressure, and above all, thanks to subscriptions to Strategy and Future, as well as voluntary contributions by the citizens of Poland, will be beneficial in of itself. Of particular importance is the analysis of Russian strategic thought, military doctrine, and the conduct of the war in all domains shaped today and relevant to political and military decisions. This is just the initial reflection on this topic in Strategy and Future. For more information, please visit the website and watch our video debates and presentations. Finally, we invite you to subscribe to Strategy and Future, which will allow us to fulfill the mission of recreating Polish geopolitical thought and implement projects such as the 20th War.